"Ma'am, are you sure you don't want to switch seats?" the gate agent asked. "This passenger is one of our priority members." Emily Carter glanced at the crowded boarding area, then at the businessman standing beside the counter with an impatient expression. She smiled politely. "That's fine. He can have it." The businessman grabbed the upgraded seat assignment without so much as a thank you and walked away. Emily simply adjusted the strap of her worn leather carry-on and stepped into the boarding line. Nobody noticed her. Nobody remembered her. And within the next few hours, every person on that airplane would wish they had. Flight 728 from Denver to Seattle was scheduled for a routine 2-hour journey on a clear spring afternoon. The terminal buzzed with the familiar sounds of rolling luggage, coffee orders, and boarding announcements. Families gathered near charging stations. Business travelers checked emails one last time before departure. Everything looked ordinary. Emily preferred it that way. At 38 years old, she had mastered the art of blending into the background. She wore a gray sweater, dark jeans, and comfortable walking shoes. Her blonde hair rested loosely against her shoulders. Nothing about her appearance stood out. She looked like thousands of other passengers moving through American airports every day. As she stepped into the cabin, she quietly located her reassigned seat near the rear of the aircraft. Row 24. Window seat. Not ideal, but it didn't matter. She slid her carry-on beneath the seat in front of her and settled in beside the window. Outside, baggage crews moved beneath the wing while sunlight reflected across the runway. Across the aisle sat a man already talking loudly enough for half the cabin to hear him. He appeared to be in his early 40s, dressed in an expensive navy suit. A silver watch flashed beneath his cuff whenever he gestured. "Trust me," he said to the passengers around him. "Commercial aviation is safer than ever." People panic over every little bump. Several passengers listened with interest. One woman asked if he worked in aviation. The man smiled proudly. "Aerospace consulting. 20 years. He leaned back confidently. "Pilots today practically have computers flying the plane for them." A few people laughed. Emily returned her attention to the view outside. The man noticed her silence. "You fly often?" he asked. "Sometimes," Emily replied. "Business or vacation?" "A little of both." "You work around airplanes?" Emily considered the question for a moment. "Something like that." The man chuckled. "Flight attendant?" Emily smiled faintly. "Not exactly." He nodded as if he had solved the mystery anyway and returned to entertaining his audience with stories about aircraft systems and airline operations. The cabin slowly filled. Overhead bins slammed shut. Seat belts clicked into place. Flight attendants completed their final checks. A young mother settled into the row ahead with 2 children. An elderly couple shared a travel magazine across the aisle. The familiar rhythm of departure unfolded around them. Then, for the first time, Emily's attention shifted. A distant sound reached her ears. Brief, barely noticeable. A soft mechanical vibration somewhere beneath the ordinary noise of boarding. Most passengers would never have heard it. Even if they had, they would have ignored it. Emily's eyes lifted slowly toward the wing outside her window. Her expression didn't change. She simply listened. The sound disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Around her, nobody noticed anything unusual. The businessman continued talking. Children laughed. Flight attendants smiled. The aircraft pushed back from the gate exactly on schedule. But Emily kept watching the wing, her calm eyes fixed on something no one else seemed to see. The aircraft rolled smoothly toward the runway as the safety demonstration played overhead. Most passengers paid little attention. Some scrolled through their phones. Others adjusted neck pillows or finished text messages before departure. Emily remained focused on the view outside. The vibration she had noticed moments earlier had not returned, yet something about it lingered in her thoughts. It had been brief, subtle, and easy to dismiss. Even so, her instincts refused to let it go. Across the aisle, the aerospace consultant continued holding court. His name, according to the conversation drifting through the cabin, was Daniel Mercer. He seemed to enjoy having an audience. "Modern airliners are incredible machines," Daniel said confidently. "Redundant systems everywhere. Even if something goes wrong, there are backups for the backups." Several passengers nodded approvingly. "So there is really nothing to worry about?" the elderly woman across from him asked. Daniel smiled. "Statistically, your drive to the airport was far more dangerous than this flight." The answer appeared to reassure her. Emily quietly fastened her seat belt and rested her hands in her lap. The aircraft paused briefly at the runway threshold. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected across the wing. Ground crews appeared tiny in the distance. Then came the familiar surge of acceleration. The engines increased power, and the aircraft began its takeoff roll. Conversation stopped. The cabin vibrated gently as speed built. Children pressed their faces against windows. Coffee cups rattled softly against tray tables. Emily watched the wing carefully. Everything appeared normal. For the first 30 seconds, the climb was smooth. Denver slowly shrank beneath them. Neighborhoods became patterns. Roads became lines. Mountains stretched across the horizon beneath a cloudless sky. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated. Flight attendants stayed seated. The aircraft banked gently toward its assigned route. Then Emily heard it again. A faint sound. Different this time. Not louder, just clearer. Her eyes narrowed slightly. The noise lasted less than 2 seconds. Most passengers would have mistaken it for ordinary aircraft sounds. Emily did not. She looked toward the wing root and then toward the engine housing. Her expression remained calm, but her attention sharpened. Daniel noticed her looking outside. "First-time flyer?" he asked jokingly. Emily turned toward him. "No. You keep studying that wing like it owes you money." A few nearby passengers laughed. Emily offered a polite smile. "Just paying attention." Daniel leaned back confidently. "Trust me, if something was wrong, the pilots would already know." Emily did not argue. She simply nodded and returned her gaze to the window. Several rows ahead, a flight attendant passed through the aisle conducting a quick visual check. Everything appeared routine. Yet as she reached the middle of the cabin, Emily noticed something else. The attendant glanced briefly toward the forward galley. It was only a fraction of a second, but the look carried a hint of concern. Not fear, not panic, just awareness. The kind that trained professionals exchanged when something unexpected appeared. The attendant immediately resumed her smile and continued working. Most passengers never noticed. Emily did. Outside, the aircraft continued climbing steadily through 20,000 feet. The sky remained calm. The cabin remained comfortable. The flight seemed perfectly ordinary. But somewhere beyond the visible routine, tiny pieces were beginning to move into place. And for the first time since boarding, Emily felt certain of one thing. Whatever she had heard earlier was not going away. 10 minutes later, the aircraft leveled near its cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign switched off with a soft chime, and a wave of normalcy moved through the cabin. Passengers relaxed immediately. Laptops appeared. Headphones went on. The young mother ahead of Emily opened coloring books for her children. Flight attendants began preparing beverage carts. To everyone else, the flight had settled into the predictable rhythm of an ordinary afternoon. Emily was the exception. She continued watching. Not nervously, not anxiously, simply observing. The sounds she had noticed earlier had become easier to recognize. Tiny clues hidden beneath the steady hum of the aircraft. Most people heard noise. Emily heard patterns. Across the aisle, Daniel Mercer accepted a cup of coffee and resumed entertaining his audience. "See," he said with a grin. "Smooth as glass. Exactly what I expected." The elderly woman smiled. "You were right." Daniel lifted his cup slightly. "I usually am." Several passengers laughed politely. Emily glanced toward him for only a second before returning her attention to the window. Far below, the Rocky Mountains stretched across the landscape like folds in a giant blanket. The sky remained clear, yet something continued to bother her. Then it happened again. This time the sound lasted longer. A faint mechanical shudder passed through the airframe. Not enough to alarm passengers. Barely enough to feel. But Emily saw the reaction immediately. A flight attendant pushing a beverage cart froze for half a second. Another attendant near the galley looked toward the front of the aircraft. Their expressions remained professional, but they exchanged a glance. It disappeared almost instantly. Most passengers never noticed. Emily did. A few minutes later, the public address system activated. Captain Ryan Walker's voice filled the cabin. Calm, confident, professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a minor systems indication that we are currently evaluating. There is no immediate concern. We simply ask everyone to remain seated while our crew completes a routine assessment. Thank you for your cooperation." The announcement sounded reassuring. It was designed to. Yet the choice of words caught Emily's attention. Routine assessment. Minor systems indication. No immediate concern. Those phrases usually meant the crew was still gathering information. Around the cabin, passengers reacted differently. Some ignored the announcement completely. Others exchanged uncertain looks. Daniel smiled and waved dismissively. Perfectly normal, he declared. Aircraft report little issues all the time. The people around him seemed relieved by his confidence. Emily remained silent. A few moments later, she noticed something new. The engine sound had not changed. The airflow sounded normal, but a subtle vibration appeared beneath the floor. It arrived in short intervals, almost rhythmic. Emily placed her fingertips lightly against the armrest. Counting, listening, measuring. Her eyes narrowed slightly. 30 seconds later, the vibration returned. Same interval, same duration. Her attention shifted toward the wing again. She studied the aircraft's behavior carefully. Tiny corrections, small adjustments. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, yet enough to confirm what she had already begun to suspect. Whatever problem existed was not isolated. It was spreading through multiple systems. At the front of the aircraft, behind the closed cockpit door, Captain Ryan Walker and First Officer Ethan Brooks were receiving information that passengers could not see. And somewhere between the cockpit and row 24, Emily Carter quietly realized that the situation was becoming far more serious than anyone in the cabin understood. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere had changed completely. Captain Ryan Walker sat forward in his seat, studying a growing list of messages across the flight display. Beside him, First Officer Ethan Brooks worked methodically through electronic checklists. Neither man showed panic. Both had thousands of flight hours and years of experience handling unexpected situations. But experience had taught them something important. The most concerning problems were often the ones that refused to fit neatly into a known category. Hydraulic pressure fluctuation again, Ethan said quietly. Ryan nodded. Third time in 6 minutes. Another caution message appeared, then disappeared, then returned. None of them remained active long enough to trigger an emergency procedure, yet together they painted a troubling picture. Individual systems were reporting abnormalities that should not have been connected. Electrical bus looks stable, Ethan said. Engine parameters are normal. Ryan stared at the display. Then why are we getting control surface inconsistencies? Neither pilot had an answer. The aircraft continued flying normally, but only on the surface. Beneath that appearance, small anomalies were multiplying. Back in the cabin, beverage service had stopped. Flight attendants moved through the aisle collecting cups and trays earlier than expected. Their smiles remained professional, but passengers were beginning to notice the difference. Questions appeared in whispers. Curious glances shifted toward the front of the aircraft. Daniel Mercer remained confident. If there was a real problem, they would tell us, he announced. Airlines have procedures for everything. His certainty reassured some people. Others remained unconvinced. Emily sat quietly beside the window. Her attention had never left. The aircraft. Another vibration passed through the cabin. This time it lasted almost 3 seconds. The young mother ahead of her looked up immediately. A child paused in the middle of coloring a picture. Several passengers exchanged uncertain looks. The vibration stopped. Silence returned. Emily slowly looked down toward the floor beneath her feet, then toward the wing outside, then toward the ceiling above. Listening, measuring, connecting details. Something was wrong with the way the aircraft was compensating. Not the problem itself, the response to it. That realization bothered her more than the warnings. A flight attendant named Melissa passed nearby. Emily noticed the tension behind her practiced smile. Melissa moved professionally from row to row, but her eyes occasionally drifted toward the cockpit. As she reached Emily's row, another brief shudder passed through the airframe. Melissa instinctively grabbed a seat back for balance. "Are you all right?" Emily asked calmly. Melissa nodded immediately. "Of course, just a little unexpected turbulence." Emily glanced out the window. The sky remained perfectly clear. Melissa followed her gaze and quickly continued down the aisle. 20 minutes later, another announcement arrived. This time, Captain Walker's voice sounded slightly more deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently evaluating a technical issue affecting several onboard systems. The aircraft remains fully controllable, and there is no immediate danger. However, we are asking everyone to remain seated with seat belts fastened while we complete our assessment." The cabin grew noticeably quieter. Daniel stopped talking. The elderly woman tightened her seat belt. The children looked toward their mother. Emily closed her eyes for a moment as if replaying every sound she had heard since departure. When she opened them again, the certainty had settled into place. Whatever the pilots believed they were dealing with was only part of the picture. The real problem was still hiding somewhere deeper inside the aircraft, and every passing minute was bringing it closer to the surface. The next 15 minutes felt longer than the previous hour. The aircraft remained stable enough to avoid panic, yet the atmosphere inside the cabin had changed completely. Conversations had become quieter. Passengers checked the faces of flight attendants more often than their phones. Every unusual sound attracted attention. Every announcement was anticipated before it arrived. Emily remained exactly as she had been since departure. Calm, observant, focused. The difference was that she was no longer trying to determine whether a problem existed. She was trying to understand its source. Another subtle vibration traveled through the floor beneath her feet. Emily counted silently. 1, 2, 3. The vibration faded. 28 seconds later, it returned. Same interval. Nearly identical duration. Her eyes shifted toward the wing outside the window, then toward the overhead panels, then toward the aisle. A pattern was emerging. Across from her, Daniel Mercer was noticeably less talkative than before. He still projected confidence, but his voice lacked the certainty that had filled the cabin earlier. Probably just a sensor issue, he said to nobody in particular. These systems are incredibly complex. Nobody responded. Even Daniel seemed unconvinced by his own explanation. A flight attendant moved through the cabin performing another visual check. This time it was Melissa. She maintained her professional smile, but fatigue was beginning to show around her eyes. As she passed Emily's row, another brief shudder moved through the aircraft. Melissa stopped for a moment. Emily looked up at her. How long ago did the first warning appear? Melissa blinked. Excuse me. The first warning in the cockpit, Emily said quietly. Melissa hesitated. I'm not sure what you mean. Emily nodded. Of course. Melissa continued down the aisle, but something about the exchange stayed with her. 5 minutes later, she returned carrying a bottle of water for a passenger several rows ahead. As she passed Emily again, she slowed slightly. Why would you ask that? She said softly. Emily looked out the window before answering. Because whatever is happening is affecting multiple systems at once. Melissa's expression changed. Just slightly. How would you know that? Emily rested her hands calmly on the armrests. Because the aircraft is compensating. Melissa stared at her. Compensating for what? Emily listened for a moment as another faint vibration passed through the cabin. That is the problem, she replied. I do not think the warnings are identifying the actual failure. Melissa remained silent. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Emily reached into her carry-on bag and removed a small notebook. She opened it and quickly wrote several lines. Not guesses, not theories, observations, intervals, timing, behavioral patterns. She tore out the page and folded it once. Melissa looked down at it uncertainly. What is this? Emily handed it to her. If the captain is still trying to isolate the problem, give him that. Melissa looked genuinely confused. Why would I do that? Emily met her eyes for the first time since boarding. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle. Because the issue is probably not where he is looking. Melissa glanced at the folded paper in her hand, then back at Emily. For reasons she could not fully explain, she suddenly felt compelled to take it seriously. Melissa stood motionless for a moment, staring at the folded sheet of paper in her hand. Everything about her training told her not to interrupt a cockpit already managing a technical situation with observations from a passenger. Yet something about Emily's calm confidence made the decision unexpectedly difficult. She finally nodded once and walked toward the front of the aircraft. Emily returned her attention to the window as though nothing unusual had happened. Several rows away, Daniel Mercer had been watching the exchange. Curiosity replaced some of his earlier confidence. What was that about? He asked. Emily looked at him briefly. Nothing important. Daniel frowned. The flight attendant seemed to think it was important. Emily simply smiled and said nothing more. At the front of the cabin, Melissa knocked gently on the reinforced cockpit door. After receiving permission, she stepped inside. Captain Ryan Walker looked up from the instrument displays. Everything all right back there? Melissa hesitated before holding out the folded paper. One of the passengers asked me to give you this. Ryan accepted it with visible confusion. A passenger? Ethan Brooks glanced over while continuing to monitor the systems. Ryan unfolded the note. The cockpit became silent. 3 lines had been written in precise handwriting. Hydraulic fluctuation is likely secondary. Check synchronization between control compensation and electrical load transitions. Timing interval approximately 28 seconds. Ryan read it twice. Then a third time. Ethan noticed the change in his expression. What is it? Ryan handed him the paper. Ethan studied the note carefully. His eyebrows lifted. Who wrote this? Melissa pointed toward the cabin. A woman in row 24. Ryan stared at her. Did she say how she knows any of this? Melissa shook her head. No, Captain. Ethan continued reading. The interval is correct. Ryan immediately turned back toward the displays. Pull the load transition history. Ethan entered several commands. Seconds passed. Then his expression changed. Ryan, I see it. The timing matched. Exactly. For the first time since the warnings had begun, the scattered abnormalities started aligning into a single pattern. Ryan sat back in disbelief. That is not something a random passenger guesses. Melissa looked between them. Should I be concerned? Ryan answered honestly. You should be impressed. Back in the cabin, another announcement had not yet arrived, but passengers sensed movement. Flight attendants exchanged quick conversations. The atmosphere continued tightening. Daniel leaned slightly toward Emily. You work in aviation, do not you? Emily remained focused on the wing outside. I used to. Pilot? Daniel asked. Emily paused. Something like that. Before he could continue, Melissa returned. She stopped beside Emily's seat. The captain would like to know your background. Several nearby passengers immediately looked up. Emily seemed almost amused by the question. Tell him I spent a long time testing aircraft that did not always behave the way engineers expected. Melissa blinked. That is what I should tell him. Emily nodded. Exactly that. Melissa hurried away. Daniel stared at Emily in complete confusion. The woman who had quietly given up her seat, barely spoken during the flight, and spent the last hour listening to vibrations in the floor suddenly seemed very different. And somewhere beyond the cockpit door, Captain Ryan Walker had already begun wondering who exactly was sitting in row 24. Melissa disappeared behind the cockpit door once again. This time she remained inside for nearly a full minute. When the door finally opened, her expression had changed. She walked directly toward row 24 without hesitation. Passengers noticed immediately. Conversation stopped. Eyes followed her movement through the cabin. Melissa stopped beside Emily's seat. Ma'am, she said quietly. The captain would like to speak with you. The reaction was immediate. Daniel Mercer stared in disbelief. The elderly couple across the aisle looked up from their seats. Even the young mother several rows ahead turned around. Emily closed her notebook, slipped it into her bag, and stood calmly. Of course, she replied. There was no excitement in her voice. No surprise. It sounded as though she had been expecting the request all along. As Melissa guided her toward the front of the aircraft, a strange silence followed. Passengers watched the woman they had barely noticed for most of the flight walk steadily down the aisle. Daniel felt increasingly uncomfortable. He replayed every conversation they had shared since boarding. Every assumption, every joke, every confident statement he had made. None of it felt particularly intelligent anymore. At the cockpit door, Melissa entered first. A moment later, Emily stepped inside. Captain Ryan Walker looked up immediately. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Ryan studied her face carefully. Then he looked back at the note still resting beside the flight displays. You wrote this? He asked. Emily nodded. Yes. Ethan Brooks leaned slightly forward. How did you identify the timing interval? Emily glanced toward the instrument screens. I listened. Ethan blinked. You listened? The vibrations were repeating at predictable intervals. Ryan exchanged a quick look with Ethan. Most people would never notice that. Emily shrugged slightly. Most people are not trained to. Ryan leaned back. Melissa said you spent time testing aircraft. I did. Military. Emily paused for a moment. Mostly. Ethan studied her carefully. What exactly did you do? Emily looked toward the displays again. Her eyes moved across the information with unusual familiarity. Flight test evaluation. Systems integration. Failure response validation. The cockpit became quiet. Ryan stared at her. Those were not casual aviation terms. Those were the words used by people who worked at the highest levels of aircraft development. How many years? Ryan finally asked. 14. Ethan slowly exhaled. Suddenly several things made sense. The observations, the terminology, the confidence, the note. Another caution message briefly appeared on one of the displays. Emily immediately looked toward it. There, she said. Ryan followed her gaze. What? That transition. Ethan checked the data stream. His expression changed instantly. Ryan saw it too. The same pattern from the note was appearing again. Only now it was becoming stronger. Emily folded her arms and watched the displays carefully. You are tracking the symptoms, she said calmly. The source is somewhere else. Neither pilot argued. For the first time since the problem began, they were no longer looking at a passenger. They were looking at someone who understood the aircraft almost as well as they did. Perhaps better. And outside the cockpit, an entire cabin of passengers sat waiting, unaware that the woman they had overlooked since boarding was about to change everything. Ryan shifted slightly in his seat and pointed toward the display showing the recurring anomalies. What are we missing? He asked. Emily stepped closer, careful not to interfere with either pilot. Her eyes moved across the instruments with the practiced focus of someone who had spent years inside test aircraft. She was not searching for a single warning. She was searching for relationships, patterns, connections, the things that ordinary checklists could miss. Another fluctuation appeared, then vanished. Emily watched the timing. There, she said quietly. Ethan immediately highlighted the data stream. I see the transition. Emily nodded. The hydraulic warnings are following it, not causing it. Ryan looked back at the display. You think the electrical system is driving everything? Not the entire system, Emily replied. One control management pathway. Ethan frowned. That would explain why multiple systems keep reporting problems without producing a clear failure. Emily nodded again. The aircraft is correcting itself repeatedly. Every correction creates another warning somewhere else. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Ryan slowly leaned back. The explanation fit better than anything they had seen so far. More importantly, it explained why every symptom appeared disconnected. They had been treating separate warnings when the real issue sat beneath all of them. Ethan quickly began reviewing additional data. If she is right, the compensation cycle is creating the vibration. Exactly, Emily said. Ryan looked toward her. How familiar are you with this type of system architecture? Emily paused briefly. I helped evaluate early versions of similar designs. Ryan stared at her. Ethan stopped typing. Helped evaluate. Ethan repeated. Emily offered a small smile. A long time ago. Another message flashed across the display. This time Ryan reacted immediately. Following Emily's observations, he checked a different data source instead of the warning itself. Seconds later his eyes widened. There it is. Ethan looked over. You found it. Ryan nodded. The synchronization fault. The cockpit suddenly felt different. Not because the problem had disappeared, but because it finally made sense. For nearly an hour they had been chasing symptoms. Now they were looking directly at the source. Ryan contacted operations and maintenance support, while Ethan implemented a revised management procedure. The aircraft responded almost immediately. The next compensation cycle arrived weaker than before. Then another. Weaker again. Emily listened carefully. The vibration beneath the floor was fading. Not gone, but fading. Ryan noticed it too. Pressure readings are stabilizing. Ethan checked the data. Control responses are normalizing. For the first time since the warnings began, both pilots allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. Outside the cockpit, passengers remained unaware of the technical details. They only sensed that something was changing. The cabin felt calmer. Flight attendants moved with renewed confidence. Even the tension in the air seemed lighter. Daniel Mercer sat quietly now, watching the closed cockpit door. The certainty that had filled his voice earlier had vanished completely. Back inside, Ryan turned toward Emily. You may have just saved us hours of troubleshooting. Emily shook her head gently. You solved it. Ryan smiled. Only after you showed us where to look. And as the aircraft continued toward Seattle beneath a clear afternoon sky, the woman from row 24 remained exactly what she had been since boarding. Calm, humble, and far more extraordinary than anyone outside that cockpit had yet realized. 40 minutes later, the skyline of Seattle appeared beyond the cockpit windows. The aircraft was operating normally again. The warnings had stopped. The vibrations had disappeared. The endless cycle of confusing system messages was gone. What remained was the quiet satisfaction of a problem understood and successfully managed. Captain Ryan Walker completed his final approach briefing while Ethan Brooks monitored the displays one last time. Everything looked exactly as it should. Ryan glanced toward Emily. I still cannot believe you identified that from the cabin. Emily smiled faintly. You would be surprised what you notice when you spend enough years listening to airplanes. Ryan shook his head. No, I think I would be surprised by your career. Emily offered no response. A few minutes later, the aircraft touched down smoothly on the runway. Applause erupted throughout the cabin. It began with a handful of passengers and quickly spread. People smiled. Some laughed with relief. Others simply seemed grateful to be on the ground. To them, the flight had ended successfully after an unusual technical issue. Most still had no idea how unusual it had actually been. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Ryan activated the public address system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Walker. Thank you for your patience and professionalism during today's flight. We experienced a technical issue that required extensive evaluation, and I am pleased to report that we arrived safely thanks to the outstanding work of our crew. The passengers listened attentively. Ryan paused briefly before continuing. However, there is someone else I would like to recognize. Emily immediately looked toward him. During the flight, a passenger provided an observation that helped us identify the root cause of the issue significantly faster than we otherwise could have. Her expertise proved invaluable. A wave of curiosity spread through the cabin. Heads turned in every direction. Ryan continued, Ms. Emily Carter, thank you for your assistance. The entire cabin looked toward row 24. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then applause returned. Louder this time. Passengers smiled and turned toward Emily. Melissa grinned openly. The young mother with 2 children thanked her from several rows away. Even the elderly couple across the aisle joined the applause enthusiastically. Daniel Mercer remained seated for several seconds. Then he slowly stood and approached her. His expression contained none of the confidence he had displayed earlier. I owe you an apology, he said honestly. Emily looked surprised. For what? Daniel laughed awkwardly. For assuming I knew more than I did. Emily smiled. That happens to everyone. Daniel shook his head. Not like this. As passengers began gathering their belongings, Ryan stepped into the cabin and approached Emily personally. One more question, he said. What exactly did you do before becoming a passenger on my flight? Several nearby travelers immediately stopped to listen. Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. I was the lead flight test pilot for an advanced military evaluation program. Silence followed. Ryan blinked. Ethan nearly laughed. Melissa stared in disbelief. Daniel looked as though every conversation from the flight had suddenly replayed in his head at once. Emily simply picked up her carry-on bag. A few minutes later, she walked through the terminal alone. No celebration. No attention. No interview. Just another traveler moving through the crowd. Behind her, people continued talking about the woman who had quietly helped solve a problem that nobody else even understood. Ahead of her, passengers hurried toward baggage claim and connecting flights. Most would eventually forget the details of the flight, but they would remember one lesson. The quietest person in the room is not always the least capable. Sometimes they are simply waiting for the moment when their actions can speak louder than their words.